Today down in the comments, I want to know, what is your favorite American horror film shot outside of Los Angeles, outside of California, outside of New York, outside of the main entertainment hubs. Bonus points for as far afield as you can get. The more regional, the better. Because today we're talking about regional horror films. Hello, I'm Adam Cesare. This is Project Black T-Shirt, the channel where we take a new or a reissue horror movie, always at least one, and then pair it with a book recommendation that you will enjoy if you enjoy those movies. Today we're going to be talking about what is maybe my most anticipated release of the year, and we're going to see whether or not it lives up to that anticipation. This is Arrow Video's box set of the American Horror Project Volume 2. Now, a few years ago, I think it's almost 3 years ago now at this point, Arrow partnered with curator Stephen Thrower, who wrote Nightmare USA and also did a book on regional horror films, which are both great. He's kind of dedicated his life and scholarship to looking at these films. Majority, at least in these sets, majority 70s films. They aren't films made within the studio system. They are horror films made in America. Some to make a buck, some to make an artistic point, but all of them have a slightly off-kilter sensibility because they aren't that kind of homogenized product, which we've come to associate, rightly or wrongly, with Hollywood filmmaking. Now, as with the last set, which I talked about years and years ago, with longer hair and a lot more stammering, and you think I stammer now, there are 3 horror films in here, and they're all very different, but they do have that unifying 70s-ness outside of Hollywoodness to them. And as with last time, there are ones I liked more and ones I liked less, but overall I think this set is a must if you're into this kind of thing. If you want to go off the beaten path and you kind of have the patience and the curiosity for it, I think this set is incredible. The 3 films are Dream No Evil, Dark August, and The Child. And I watched them in that order because they put spine numbers on them, and I'm a creature of weirdo, obsessive habit, so I watched them in that order. And the first film is Dream No Evil. Now, this is the first horror movie by John Hayes, who isn't exactly what we'd think of traditionally as like a horror director. He made 3 horror films, he made them right in a row, and then he continued on and he continued making sexploitation films, children's films. He made a bunch of movies, and Hayes worked from the late 1950s all the way up to like the 90s. He was a prolific filmmaker. Again, he only did these 3 horror films, this kind of loose trilogy of horror films, that the most famous of which is Grave of the Vampire, which I think Shout or Scream Factory just put out. Dream No Evil is the movie in this set, and it is the first one, and it is very subtle and very strange and very stagey. It opens up at an orphanage, and we see a young girl who's on the slate to be adopted, and then we kind of jump forward and see that she is obsessed with finding her real father, obsessed with the idea that her father is going to come back after all these years, after her putting up for adoption, and they're going to kind of finally be together. And in the meantime, she's starring in a church revivalist tent show, like a kind of like fire and brimstone preacher, and she's kind of the magician's assistant for this preacher. She's performing a high dive into the fires of hell for the people in the crowd to kind of cheer and clap, and the preacher to do this narration over it. And she's dating the preacher's cousin, who is in medical school, who is considering maybe infidelity with his fellow medical student. And if that sounds complicated, if that sounds soapy, it's not as soapy as I'm making it sound, but it is melodramatic, and it does have this this sheen of like relationship drama happening while all this other weirdo, impressionistic, dreamlike stuff is happening. Because eventually, she kind of disassociates and snaps, and she starts seeing her father, and is the father there? Is he a figment of her imagination? And then the father starts committing crimes. If this movie didn't have this very literal, very clearly added after the fact narration to it, it would probably be either more effective or less, because you either would have no idea what's going on for large chunks of it, or, as I kind of felt at times during the movie, the narration's a little bit too on the nose. It's telling me exactly what's happening on screen when there should be level of ambiguity to it. But there are dream sequences, as the title implies in this movie, that are really, really cool. There's some really unsettling images, some really neat kind of American Midwest locations to it, like kind of dried up towns, like kind of rural decay look to parts of the film. It's a really, really neat movie and a great way to start the set. Not my favorite of the three, but definitely one of the most solid, and has great dialogue and feels assured in its weirdness in a way that a lot of films don't. All the films have these little 10-minute or 15-minute appreciations, I guess they call them, by Stephen Thrower, who put together the whole set. Each one of those, I kind of watch those first, and they do a good job of setting up, like, contextualizing, all right, what the heck is this movie I just watched? Who made it? Where did they make it? Why did they make it? And the features on this set mostly kind of speak to Hayes and who Hayes was, and Hayes outside of even Dream No Evil, which I think is a very interesting approach, and not an approach that the other two films in the set, or the extras for the films in the set, take. There's even a long conversation that Thrower had recorded with Rue McCallaghan from the Golden Girls, because she was kind of a constant collaborator, especially early in her life with Hayes. He kind of discovered her. But she has nothing but nice things to say about him, and it was very interesting, even if it doesn't directly pertain to Dream No Evil, a movie she's not in. Next we have Dark August, and Dark August was the film I guess I was looking forward to least in this set, because it's the one film that I'd not really heard anything about. I hadn't heard about the director, I hadn't heard about the film itself. It's just kind of, it was an enigma to me, so I threw it on. In the order that I was watching them. I wasn't just going to skip to The Child, because that was the one that I was kind of most looking forward to. But Dark August, lo and behold, is my favorite film in the set, easily. This is from a director named Martin Goldman. He's a filmmaker who started on Madison Avenue in advertising, made a bunch of commercials, and was kind of like, you know what, I have a story to tell. I am a New Yorker who loves visiting Vermont, and kind of fell in love with the rustic edge and the towns in Vermont, and Stowe, Vermont in particular. And I'm gonna make a film. I could call in favors. I've already made commercials. I've already made very successful commercials. I'm gonna call in favors, and I'm gonna make this picture. And the result is Dark August, which is definitely the most polished film in the set. It looks like a major Hollywood production. It has beautiful cinematography. Goldman favors long takes, which feels like a very modern thing in regional filmmaking in 1975. I was just so surprised some of these sequences where you have these almost longish improvisational takes with a good amount of blocking and a good amount of plot being related, and I was just kind of sitting back and wonder who the heck made this, and why have I never heard of this movie? It concerns a New York transplant professional artist, Italian-American guy, seemingly on the brink of a midlife crisis, but when we meet him, he's actually had a real life, not midlife, not invented crisis. He's been involved in a fatal accident that killed a young girl in Vermont, where he's trying to live, where he's kind of a transplant, and he's kind of trying to set down roots. This little girl is survived by her grandfather. That has, at the very beginning of the movie, the first thing we see is the grandfather basically putting a curse, putting a hex on this dude from New York. So while he's got all this other kind of infidelity and rocky relationships and midlife crisis, while he's got all this other kind of character study type stuff going on, almost in the background of all that is this curse. This mysterious robed figure keeps showing up. He goes into town, and the creepy old man who has every reason in the world to hate this dude is just all constantly hanging out there, constantly eyeballing him, and it's just this incredible location-rich character study that is in certain sequences. There's one in particular, very, very, very scary. It has a real cosmic horror element to it, a real folk horror element to it, because it is this kind of backwoods witches' covens and stuff like that. And the kind of big star power in the film is Kim Hunter from Streetcar Named Desire and Planet of the Apes, but she is She plays kind of almost an extended cameo where she is this white witch that they come to see to try to get the hex off of him. But there's so many kind of stunner sequences in a relatively kind of short, compact little movie. But this was such a cool discovery. But Dark August and the alternate art that Arrow puts on all these is kind of cool, but it almost has a kind of homogenizing effect, I feel. But the alternate art, I love that. I love that poster. I kind of want to get it. But this was a really cool movie. The features on this one are maybe not quite as expansive as on Dream No Evil, but they do sit down for a good long time with director Martin Goldman. He does both a commentary and an on-camera interview. And the on-camera interview is one of the better special features I've seen over the last year. It's really, really honest. It's really, really cool. He's very sharp, very funny. And I can kind of listen to him talk forever. He also talked to Marion Cantor, who's one of the producers of the film. She talks about kind of just brass tacks, like logistics of how hard it was to get a movie like this made. It's just really interesting, and the things these folks remember 40 years on are pretty invaluable. And artist Stephen Bissett, who you probably have seen his art, also is, I guess he's a Vermonter too, so they talked to him for like 30 minutes where he just talks about all the horror film connections of Vermont. And not even like horror films filmed in Vermont, but horror films that are like ostensibly set in Vermont, even though they weren't filmed in Vermont, or that mention Vermont. It's a kind of neat rabbit hole type extra feature to have, even though it doesn't 100% pertain that much to Dark August. But Dark August is kind of the inspiration to talk about this wider idea of folk horror in Vermont. Of which Dark August is an incredible example. When this set was first announced, I kind of just assumed that The Child would be my favorite film in the set. Dark August was just so good, that doesn't mean that The Child is bad. It just, it kind of overshadowed it a little bit. Made by a producing and directing duo of Armenian Americans who came to this country and kind of bonded in college and found each other and bonded over their love of filmmaking, their shared kind of background, and their love of horror movies, their love of, in particular, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And they basically saw Night of the Living Dead, and they said, we can do that. We can make a picture just like that. Robert Voskanian and Robert Dadashian kind of set out to make The Child, a movie that in some respects is similar to Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and in other respects takes inspiration from killer kid movies like The Bad Seed, and mashes it up with zombie or monster or ghoul horror, and just shoots it through with this very, very weird outsider perspective. It is the movie in the set that feels the most homemade, that feels the most. It was shot over 3 years. They talk about on the special features how they barely had money to develop film. Sometimes they would shoot a bunch of film and they would keep it in their fridges, and they're like, then they would keep it in their refrigerator until they can have it developed, and until they can make dailies and then cut a scene together. So it is this kind of shoestring, you can do it type, DIY type feel to the film. But that's in some ways, and there's acting that runs the gamut from perfectly fine to really not fine. But this is not a movie that's like, this is not a so bad it's good movie. This is a movie that has rougher elements and more DIY elements, but it's a film that I would say is actively pretty successful and actively pretty creepy. It's about a young woman who, we first meet her, her car runs off the road into a ditch, and she has to walk all the way to her this babysitting assignment. She's gonna take over being the nanny for this young girl, Rosalie. This family where she first meets the family's neighbor, the family that she's gonna take care of this kid. The neighbor kind of set things up as like, yeah, that house is a little weird. Yeah, that family's a little weird. Yeah, death seems to surround that family. But she's undeterred, and she goes and she starts taking care of this kid. But the very first thing we see is we see Rosalie out in the graveyard that is near her house, feeding the ghouls that live in the graveyard live kittens and stuff like that. So she is an evil little kid, but she's not an evil little kid that's, I guess, possessed. She's not an evil little kid that has special powers, even though she kind of does. She is an evil little kid who has an army of ghouls at her beck and call, an army of zombies, for want of a better term, and the zombie effects are really cool looking. The gothic live by a cemetery vibe of the movie is just kind of like one slice of this movie's trying to hit every subgenre pie. So we've got the fog-covered gothic cemetery, we've got the evil little blonde girl, we've got ghouls, we've got all this different stuff thrown in a blender. It was clear that the filmmakers took inspiration from all different little areas, especially because they were filming it over a series of 3 years, and the movie just feels like 85 minutes of, here, we're doing it, we're making a horror movie, and I really like it. It does start with a title card from Harry Novak's production company, Harry Novak's distribution company, and I was always kind of under the impression, because Something Weird Video had released it, and because they'd released so many other Harry Novak produced films, including like the Frederick Friedel films, Axe and Kidnapped Coed, I always kind of thought he had something to do with making it, but he didn't. These guys made it themselves. They got Novak involved, and he distributed the film. And I think he distributed the film fairly successfully, because he did it a lot, and he did the normal thing where you'd rename it and release it in a different district, or rename it and release it in another drive-in a couple years later. But the real bummer is, as Stephen Thrower points out in the special features here, is that they never got to make another movie again, because Novak took the film and they never got to see any of the money from all those different re-releases and all those different royalties, which they could have taken that money and funneled it back into a second feature. But as it stands, The Child is a really interesting, kind of creepy, kind of slapdash, kind of weird. It's one of those movies that gets sampled in a Rob Zombie song. I don't even know what song it is, but it's the line like, "What were you doing in the cemetery?" And the little girl goes, "I don't have to tell you anything." And like, it's very weird line delivery, kind of built for Rob Zombie to sample in a song. And that's kind of what The Child is. The Child is a movie that you can clearly see the warped kind of schlock-a-minute influence in the film, and it's boldly made. It has weird music, very weird editing, very weird framing, very claustrophobic. I watched it in the Pillbox 1:3 version they have on here. They have a blown up zoomed version of it that I watched a little bit of, but I watched the full frame version of it. It's got just a weird effect of like, feels restrictive and it feels claustrophobic. So for this week's book recommendation, we are not going to talk about horror. We are not going to talk about regional horror. We're going to talk about Laird Barron's Black Mountain, which is the follow-up to the second book in the Isaiah Coleridge series. While I'm holding up Black Mountain, while I'm talking about Black Mountain, if you haven't read the book that comes before this, Blood Standard, you kind of have to. They're not a strict continuation, but he is for lack of a better term, or in this one he fully is, a detective character, a kind of hard-boiled detective character, and you should read the first one just so you know kind of what the status quo is and how we set up the status quo in this second book. But I might even like the second book better. I really liked Blood Standard. I think I even talked about it on one of the episodes. Isaiah Coleridge is not your typical tough guy character in a lot of ways, but in some ways kind of is. He does realize that he is like almost like a Sam Spade type character in the book. But Laird Barron, known for writing horror, known for writing cosmic horror, one of the best cosmic horror authors alive. He's an incredible horror writer. What's great about these books is that he hasn't really left horror. These are books about a half Maori Alaskan transplant tough guy solving crimes in upstate New York, but they have this weight of like mythological memory that presses down on Coleridge, that has made him the man he is as we see him solving crimes. In this one, he's the body of a mob enforcer washes up in his backyard, and he's tasked by the mob, because they have stuff over him. He's tasked by the mob of finding out who killed this enforcer, because the mob doesn't like other people taking out their people. So it's a mystery in that sense, but it does have this great cosmic horror feel to it. Coleridge is a great character. He's kind of a really cool narrator. And a lot of times with tough guy literature, a lot of times with like overly gritty, overly noirized literature, I kind of don't believe it. I kind of don't buy the posturing. But Barron is such a good writer, and he is originally an Alaskan native who is living in upstate New York, kind of like his character here. It does, I've never met him, and I think he's probably a nice guy, but when he describes bodily harm and he describes the way Coleridge kind of assesses a situation, like, you know, I picture a person as like a triangle and I can break their nose this way and I can do this. Like when he talks the tough guy talk, I legitimately believe it and I find it legitimately scary. So Black Mountain, very much recommended. Probably the stronger of the two, I think. But I love both these books, and you can't pick up Black Mountain without reading Blood Standard. So that's in paperback now. This is an ARC, but I think it's in hardcover, ebook, audiobook. But yeah, I would very, very much recommend picking up Blood Standard and just buy Black Mountain at the same time. They're both great. You're going to want to continue through. Yeah, very, very much recommended. And regional. That's why I wanted to pair it with the American Horror Project. Even though they're very, very different tonally, it does have that feeling of, wow, we're getting outside of my normal comfort zone where things are usually produced. This feels like I get a little bit of Alaska, I get a lot of upstate New York, and it really does feel like this is a different world. This person describing this has lived a different life. And it does have that kind of almost outsider perspective, even though Laird Barron's not an outsider artist. He's like a master craftsman. But it does have that feel to it. And it does have that novelty to it. All right, I'm Adam Cesare. If you'd like to find out more about me or my books, I've got ebooks, audiobooks, comic books. In summer 2020, I will have a YA book for you, YA novel for you. If you want to find out about any of that, please go to my website, check out my mailing list, follow me on Twitter, so you can keep up with all that and go buy and review those books.